Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for tuning in. So as you can see today, I'm not outside, I'm at home, and together we're going to look at how I edit my images in Lightroom and Photoshop. So let's jump into it. Alright, so here we are inside of Lightroom in my catalog. We're going to look at a couple of images. Before that, just to give you an idea of my basic workflow. For 99% of my images, I do the bulk of the edit in Lightroom, and then I finish up in Photoshop. The main thing that I do in Lightroom is black and white conversion. I do all the cropping. I do all the global contrast adjustment. And let's say I'll bring a raw image from 0 to maybe 80% of its potential. And then I'm gonna jump into Photoshop and bring the 80% to maybe 90%, 95%, on a really good day, maybe even 100%. So I don't use any other software. The only other software that I usually include in my workflow, it's a plugin for Photoshop called SilverFX Pro, which I mainly use for black and white emulation, and especially to add grain to my images, because I really like to add some grain to make the image more organic and more alive than a simple digital file. At least that's what I think. So that's my workflow. Without further ado, let's start with the first image. And this is the final image of this really beautiful tree from Hokkaido. Let me zoom out so you can see it. So yeah, this image, this location is a really famous location, and I think the biggest reason why it's so famous now is because of Michael Kenna's work around this area. So this was shot on my first trip to Hokkaido a couple of years ago, and by looking at this image, you might actually think that this is a really serene scene, that I was immersed in nature. But the truth is, this tree is on private property, and it's got so famous now that you have so many tourists like flocking in just to take pictures of this tree, which is called the Christmas tree of BA. It was my first time in Hokkaido, so I didn't expect that, but you can actually see buses and buses of Korean tourists that just pass by, stop there, jump out the bus to take pictures of this particular tree. And it's something really weird if you think about it, because it's just a tree, but you have buses of people taking this same image. So of course this is not the most original landscape image that you can take in Hokkaido, but I think it's a really iconic location, and it's also a really simple way to demonstrate how to convert this into a really nice black and white minimal image. So yeah, that's the story behind the image. Of course, this is the final edit, and this is, let me go back to 100%, and this is the raw file. So we're gonna bring this image up to this point only by using Lightroom and Photoshop. It's going to be really easy. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to go into my develop module into Lightroom, and here I usually apply the same set of edits and rules to all my images. The first one is the profile conversion that I do up on this tab here. And I usually use for my Nikons the camera monochrome with red filter, which is exactly the same profile that I set up in my camera when I take the image, so I have continuity. As you can see, with just one click I changed the image from color to black and white. And the other thing that I always do to all my images is check this enable profile corrections, And even if this is a black and white image, I always also take this remove chromatic aberration, make sure that everything is fine. And then on any other image, the first thing that I will do will be to crop the image. But as you can see here, the raw file is already cropped, and that's a feature, let's say, or maybe a defect of my Nikon D850, which is when you set up a crop in camera, that crop cannot be undone afterwards. So let's say in this case I shot this image with a 1:1 square crop, and when using a Nikon D850, that means that your raw file is actually going to be cut into a square, so there is no way that you can revert this afterwards. So you might like it, you might not like it, that's just the way it is. So in this particular case, this is already a square, it's already leveled, so I don't need to do any cropping. So on to the basic global editing. So as you can see here, this image is basically properly exposed. Of course, this is all snow, so it's really white, and that can mess with your light meter in the camera. So even by knowing that, and even by overexposing of one stop in camera, as you can see here, when you import the image, it still looks pretty gray and dull. So what I want to do here is to add more contrast to make the snow really white without blowing the highlights, and possibly increasing the contrast and make this tree even darker. So there are many ways to do that. The one that I like to use is to use the whites and the blacks. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is increase the whites by, let's say, about 50, and as you can see, this already dramatically changes the image. And then I'm gonna turn down the blacks to, let's say, minus 20 maybe, just before the blacks here on the histogram touch the bottom of the histogram without clipping. So as you can see, with just this simple correction, I have a much better contrast and a much better looking image. So the next thing that I want to do here, as you can see here, the sky was really dull and it was snowing, and this is a long exposure of really dark sky. But the difference between the gray in the sky and the white here in the snow is not very dramatic. So what I want to do is I want to increase the contrast between the sky and the snow, and a really nice and easy way to do that is by using the tone curve here in Lightroom. So what I want to do is I want to just take a point here on the line on the RGB curve, and I just want to go down until the sky looks exactly how I want it. So maybe something like this, and as you can see, this already changed a lot. But of course, by doing this, the snow is also affected. So to counterbalance that, I just want to pick another point here towards the white part of the image, and I'm just gonna bring this back up, maybe up to here, like so. And as you can see, with this simple adjustment only, we dramatically changed how the image looks. This is the before and this is the after. I really like the way how the tree now is really dark and stands out in the middle of the snow field. So basically this is all I would do to this image in Lightroom. The only other thing that I might want to do, you can see here there is a dust spot, because of course I was in the middle of a snowstorm shooting with my camera, changing lenses, so it is just normal to get dust spots everywhere. So it's just a case here that I only got one. Usually I get many more. So what I want to do is just I want to get my spot removal tool, pick the size, and just get rid of this dusty spot. And that's it. It was really easy. So now I think I have a really good starting point to edit this image in Photoshop. So I'm gonna export it. And I like to export all my images when I work in Photoshop in this way. I have a preset here that I set up, for which I can export everything as a PSD file in the ProPhoto RGB color space at 16 bits. And the reason why I do this, it's because many times I have to do maybe prints, or I have to do projects that require a little bit more of color accuracy than just posting on Instagram or my website. So by using the ProPhoto RGB color space, which is one of the widest color gamuts that you can have, it allows me to be able to edit the image further if I need to, and also to convert it into Adobe RGB or an sRGB depending on what I need to do afterwards. So with these settings, I just click on export, and I'll see you in Photoshop. Alright, so here we are in Photoshop. I just opened the PSD that I just exported, as you can see. And as you can see here in the color profile, it says ProPhoto RGB 16 bits. So all is good. The image already looks really nice, but there are a couple of things that I'd like to do to make it even better. And I don't like to use complicated techniques in Photoshop. Of course, I know how to blend multiple images, I know how to use luminosity masks, but I don't actually like it. I try to keep everything as simple as possible. So for this particular image, the only two things that I want to do is, first of all, I want to create more depth, and I want to focus the view on this tree and on this part of the scene. So I'm going to achieve that by putting a vignette both on top and in the bottom of the image. As you can see here, I have two layers, and that's how I did it. I'm gonna show you in a second. And then the only other thing that I want to do, which is really important for me, is I want to apply some film grain, and I also want to apply a kind of film simulation curve. In this case, a curve that simulates T-Max from Kodak, which is black and white film that I really like, and I used to use a lot back in the day when I was shooting film. So that's gonna make the image much more organic than this digital file. So if I turn this on and off, you can see the difference. It is not huge, but of course if you zoom in, you can see the grain, which is really organic and makes the image look really good, in my opinion. And also darkens down the tree. And I really love film grain, and there are mainly two reasons why I use film grain. The first one is I think the T850 files are actually too detailed and too sharp for this kind of minimalist photography. So I always try to soften up all the details and reduce the sharpness, and also try to make the darker parts even darker and the bright parts even brighter. And the other reason is, usually my best images, or at least the images that I consider my best images, always end up as prints, and I always use matte paper, and I think film grain combined with matte paper really gives the best results. So I always apply this kind of film grain. So let's delete these 3 layers, and I'm going to show you how to do this really easily in Photoshop. So let's zoom out a little bit so we can see everything better. So the first thing that I want to do is to add my top and bottom vignette. Let's start with the top. So adding a vignette is really easy. You just need to use a gradient filter. So the first thing that you want to do is go down here to the adjustment layers and select an exposure layer, like so. And then you want to turn down the exposure maybe 1 stop. And of course, this way you will apply this exposure compensation to the whole image, which doesn't look great. And then you have your layer mask here, which at the moment it's all white, so it's all visible. So by using a gradient, and to use that you just need to push your G on your keyboard, or just select the gradient here. You can control how this effect is applied to your image. So by selecting your gradient, make sure that the transition is selected from white to black, with normal mode, opacity 100%. And then make sure that you have white in your foreground color and black in your background color. And then you basically just click and drag. As you can see, if you just click and drag, your gradient is gonna move. But if you keep your shift key clicked, it's gonna be a straight line. So shift click, drag till the point that you want to end the effect, and boom, you have your gradient here in the sky. It's not a huge difference, but if you see the before and after, it is actually pretty good in this way, and it really helps focusing more the attention on this tree. And that's it really. So let's do one more for the bottom of the image. So again, another adjustment layer, exposure, -1, get my gradient, and let's make a shift click and drag up to maybe here, and there you have it. Just imagine that this white part is your matte paper for your print, and then you have your frame here. It's much better to have some separation here that brings your eye from the border of the frame to the middle of the print than just a blank and white canvas like in this case. So yeah, it really makes a big difference. So that's it. The only other thing that we need to do is to apply our film grain, and we are going to use this plugin called Silver Effects Pro, which you can find here in the filters. Of course, to apply the filter, you need to merge all these layers into one layer. There are many ways to do that. There is also a really complicated keyboard shortcut, which should be something like Ctrl Shift Option E or something like that. And as you can see, I have duplicated all these 3 layers into one. And when I have this layer here, I can just go to my filters, Nik Collection, Silver Effects Pro. And it's going to take a while because my computer is really old. So bear with me for a second. Here we go. So Silver Effects Pro is a great plugin with many options, which I have to say I never use. The only option that I always use is this film types, because here is where you can set your film emulations. So at the moment this is set to neutral, but if you open here, you can see you have lots and lots of black and white beautiful film emulations. I always tend to use the same 2 or 3 film emulation, one being Acros 100, which is really contrasty and nice, and also the T-Max Pro, which is even more contrasty. And in this case, that's the one I'm going to use. So I'm going to click on this, and as you can see, the before and after, it makes the image much more contrasty. And of course, every single one of this film emulation has a grain value applied to emulate the actual film grain, so it looks very good. You cannot see it so much here, but if I zoom in 100%, you can start to see the grain here. If you turn this off, it really looks digital, just a digital image. If you turn this on, it looks much more organic, much more alive if you want. I know it might not make sense because this is, after all, a digital image, but this emulation really gives it a different type of style that I really like. Of course, if the grain is too small for you, you can always turn this down, maybe to 400 or something like that, and you do get more grain. But for this particular image, I think the default setting is actually fine, so I'll leave it like that. Go back to 100% and just apply this. And again, it's going to take a while. Alright, so as you can see here, the effect has been applied to a different layer that I can turn on and off. And that's pretty much it. There is nothing else that I would like to do on this image. As you can see, it took me maybe 5 minutes to do the final retouch on this, and it looks, I think, really good. And this is exactly how I was visioning the image inside my head when I actually took it. So let's back into Lightroom and see the difference. We started with this image, a really standard boring shot if you want, and with some simple touches in Lightroom it brought this image up to this point, which is already much better. And then with a couple of layers in Photoshop, we went from this to this, which I think brings out all the potential of this image and my vision when I actually took the shot. So that's it. Really simple things, but really simple things that make a big difference. Alright, so here we go, image number 2. This is the final image. This one was a funny one to shoot. Yeah, man, it was a really nice day, believe it or not. I was at home and I looked out of the window and I could see these really huge storm clouds during summer last year. Just these huge clouds moving in. So I just grabbed my camera and rushed to my local beach just near my house here. And I arrived there, the wind was crazy. We got so much rain, maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes after I took this shot. And the sky was really unbelievable. As you can see here, you had this black cloud, ominous cloud. And I really loved the cloud, of course, but I also loved the fact that in this part here, you can see actually the sunlight filtering in, because these clouds were moving so fast across the sea. So it's not something that you see every day, especially here. So I was really happy to go out and shoot this and get wet. I also tried to vlog the whole experience without a lot of success. A really fun image to take, one of my favorites from last year actually. So this is the final image, but as you can see here, the original file is a little bit different. So of course this was shot in color. I was in a rush, so the horizon is not leveled, and it was during a storm, so as you can see here, the beach is full of dirt and dust. So it took a little bit of work to go from this image to this image, which is a little bit more minimal and a little bit closer to my idea of what this image would have to look like. So it took a little bit of work, but not actually so much. So let's see what I did. Let's go into the develop module here in Lightroom, and again, same processing as my previous image. So change the profile to the camera monochrome red filter, and then I'm gonna enable profile correction, and that is done. And then the only other thing that I might do here that I didn't do in the previous image is I am going to crop it. So I'm gonna select the crop tool. I want a square crop, so 1 by 1. And I also want to make sure that the horizon is actually leveled. So if I go here and click, I can see my guide, and I just want to make sure that the horizon is leveled, like so. So this crop is already pretty good. I like this part, but I'd like this part to be in the middle of the image, and also I don't like the fact that this part is really bright, so it's gonna be distracting, and everyone is gonna want to look at this part instead of looking at this really nice light. So what I am going to do is I am gonna shrink it down and crop it even more, and then move everything on this side so that this light is basically in the middle, a little bit symmetrically, something like this, and that's gonna be my crop. Okay, so once that is done, I'm gonna go on and do my usual contrast, global contrast. So I can see here the darks are not so dark and the whites are not so white. So I'm gonna increase the contrast by lifting the whites a lot, actually, maybe something like 70 plus 70. And then since this is really high, I want to make sure that I don't blow any of the highlights and the highlights actually look natural. So I'm gonna reduce the highlights by about minus 50 or something like that, and that is done. And another thing that I might want to do is bring down the blacks a little bit, maybe something like minus 20, so everything gets darker. And already, as you can see, there is more contrast, but still it's not enough for me. So what I'm going to do again is I'm going to add another S-curve here, bring down the shadows like so, and bring up the higher part of the mid-tones here and the whites, something like this. And I think now this image looks pretty good here in the middle, kind of good here down in the beach, and actually here in the sky it looks too bright. So what I'm going to do now is make this part darker, so the IR's view is going to focus on this part. So I'm going to do that by using a gradient filter. So I'm going to select that, make sure to reset all these values, exposure of one stop. And then I'm gonna shift click here and add this to my sky. And as you can see, it looks much better. Now, I do like the effect here on this part, but here is still not enough. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna duplicate this, make another one, always with -1, and I'm gonna apply this to the top part of the sky once again, like so. Alright, normally if I was editing this for a portfolio, I would take a little bit more time to do this, but just to give you an idea, this is what I would do. And this already looks much better. I might add another gradient here to make the sand a little bit darker. So let's go back here, always -1, and add this to the beach like so. Alright. So everything looks good, but I think I can improve the image a little bit more by making this part a little bit brighter, so it stands out. And this is in the middle, so instead of using a gradient filter, I'm actually going to use a radial filter. So I'm going to click on the radial filter tool, make sure that everything is at 0, and then I think I'm just going to boost the whites about 50, +50. And of course this is also going to increase the highlights. I'm going to bring down the highlights a little bit, maybe -30 or something like that. And then I'm going to apply this to the middle of the image. You can even go a little bit further with the whites, maybe 60, maybe even 70. And as you can see, it's a subtle change, but if you turn this on and off, it makes a difference. And you can see the details here, you can see the light better, and there is much more contrast between these clouds and the light here. So yes, so this is it. This is all I think I should do here in Lightroom. I'm gonna export the image again and finish working this in Photoshop. Alright, so here we are again in Photoshop. Here is my image. So what do I want to do to this image in Photoshop? Well, first of all, as you can see here, I made the beach darker, much darker than the original image, but still I can see some of this garbage on the shore. So I want to get rid of those distractions and make it more pleasing to the eye. The second thing that I want to do is I want to increase the contrast between this light and all these shadows here in the sky even more. And finally, I want to apply some film grain and some film simulation as usual, because I think it's gonna look very nice as a print. Okay, so the process is exactly the same as in my previous image. There is some spot removal here that I can turn on and off, and you can see I just got rid of this dust here. And then I want to make this part a little bit darker. So again, always my exposure layer, adjustment layer here with some gradient mask just applied to the beach. There's nothing new in there. And then to increase the contrast here, this is something that I didn't do in my previous image, but I do on, I'd say, maybe 80 to 90% of my images, is I created a dodge and burn layer here to to control the whites and the blacks and to increase contrast. So if I turn this on again, you can see the difference. So this part is whiter and this part is darker. So how do you do that? This is really easy, and you can do it in many ways in Photoshop. This is the way I like to do it. So in Windows, you just need to click on Control, keep Control, click down, and Control click on there. On Mac is Command click, and you get this window here. To create a new layer, you just need to change the blending mode from normal to overlay, and then choose this option to fill with overlay neutral color 50% gray, and you'll end up with a gray layer with an overlay blending mode. Then all you need to do is grab your brush tool by pressing B on your keyboard. Make sure that you have a really soft brush, so with hardness at 0% and a low opacity, so maybe 20%, and even a low flow. And then you just have your black and white here. Every time you use the white, you make your image brighter. Every time you use the black, you make your image darker. So for example, if I just want to switch to the black and I want to make my brush a little bit bigger, I can just really gently go in and brush into my beach here, and as you can see, everything is gonna get darker before and after. And then if I want to switch to white, make the brush a little bit smaller like so, and I want to make this part whiter, brighter, I just gently brush in here. And you basically just do that with all the parts of the image that you want to edit. So for example, if I want to make this part darker, I just make a really big brush and make the whole image darker here in the sky. Okay, so it's really easy. Of course, you can always go back, you can always paint back white on black, black on white. And if you turn this off and on again, you can see there is a really huge difference. Okay, so this is the only new thing that I didn't do in the other image. It's really powerful, and I recommend you use it in basically all of your images when you edit them, because it really gives you a lot of control on what you want to show, what you want your viewer to look at in your image. And then the only other thing that I did here is again use Silver FX Pro to apply a film simulation and some grain. This time I didn't use T-Max, I actually use my beloved Acros 100 with the standard grain, which is 448, whatever that means. It's a kind of fine grain. So if I turn this on, you can see the difference, which is actually huge. There is much more contrast, and of course if I zoom in, you can see the grain makes everything look so much better. If I turn this off, yeah, nice, but still digital. If I turn this on, I don't know, there's something more to it, some more mystery to this image just by adding the grain. I cannot really explain in words. This part, I love it. So there you have it. This is all I did to this image. Some spot removal, some dodging and burning, and some field simulation. So now if we go back to Lightroom, we can see that we started with this image, which of course it's a pretty boring image of a not boring sky, And then with a couple of adjustments in Lightroom, we went from this image to this image, and then we brought this, I think, quite good image, brought it into Photoshop and turned it into what I think is a really good image. The difference is huge. Okay, really simple things, simple tools, but really powerful. Alright, that's it. This is how I edit my images in Lightroom and Photoshop to make them look really minimal. As you saw, there's nothing difficult about it. It's all about the vision that you have in your mind. So hopefully you found this video useful. If you did, remember to give it a like and subscribe to the channel, ring my bell, all the good stuff. So that's it for today. I'll see you in the next one, and ciao!